Thank you everyone. And thank you, Katie, for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be speaking today, and I look forward to sharing this fascinating biblical book and its resonances with our contemporary situation. Two brief caveats. I'm an enthusiast for rather than an expert on the Book of Lamentations. For example, I don't know biblical Hebrew. Secondly, we only have a brief time, so we'll need to make do with what we have, although I would argue that that is a useful approach to lament, since you make do with the emotions and feelings you have, not those that you don't. This presentation reflects some of my thinking on the growing realization that humanity's relationship with the rest of creation is increasingly dysfunctional, and that we as a civilization face an existential crisis. This was made particularly clear to me as we've gone through this pandemic. The first UK lockdown produced much commentary on clearer skies, the amount of birdsong and animals seen reclaiming the streets. In other words, we saw how suspending our normality can do wonders for the rest of creation. So, even though there are reasons for hope, we also see that our normal day-to-day lives contribute to death and destruction. This produces a need to grieve, to do something about the emotions that follow this realization. This is where the Book of Lamentations, the subject of the presentation, can help, giving us an insight into our situation. The presentation will first outline the context of the book and provide a quick overview. I will then outline 3 ways in which a better appreciation of this text will help us as we lament the disturbing environmental realities we face. The Book of Lamentations is 5 chapters long, all of which is poetry. The original language of the book is Hebrew, and the author is anonymous, although it's often been associated with the prophet Jeremiah. The poems in the book arise from crisis, the destruction of Jerusalem and the exile of many Judeans in 586 BC. To understand why this was such a crisis and the colossal outpouring of grief in the poetry of Lamentations and how this can sustain us in our crisis, it is worth dwelling on the context of this destruction. Jerusalem was at the heart of the kingdom of Judah. You will recall that following the death of King Solomon, the tribes of Israel divided their territory into 2. The smaller southern kingdom was the kingdom of Judah, with the city of Jerusalem as its capital. Judah considered itself uniquely blessed. It was part of the land promised by God. The city of Jerusalem itself had been promised to and captured by King David, and his descendants were promised to reign in Jerusalem forever. Even more importantly, Jerusalem was where the temple had been built, the place where priests were to lead the people in their worship of God, a sign that the connection between people and God was still secure. The temple was God's house, seen as the places of God had chosen to dwell among the chosen people. These promises of land, monarchy, and temple became elaborated into what Walter Brueggemann calls the ideology of Judah, and especially of the Jerusalem elite. This ideology of a chosen people represented by the perpetual flourishing of the Judean monarchy and the invulnerable temple was shattered by the calamities of the 6th century BC. This was the heyday of the Babylonian Empire, based in what is now Iraq. First, the ruler of Babylon attacked Jerusalem in 597 BC, plundering the temple and carrying off various treasured objects used in worship, as well as seizing captives, including the king. However, the crisis was not complete, for the temple still stood, and the man appointed to rule over Judah on the empire's behalf was a descendant of King David. But this puppet ruler, King Zedekiah, then led a rebellion against Babylonian power, who then attacked Jerusalem, besieging the city for 2 years. Finally, in 586 BC, the Babylonians were victorious, devastating the city, slaughtering members of the royal family, and taking King Zedekiah captive, along with many others, including the priests who worked in the temple. Even more shattering, the temple itself, largely spared in the previous attack, was absolutely trashed this time around. The bronze pillars and incense burners broken up and carried off, and the temple burned. The Book of Lamentations is reflecting on these events, on the utter sense of loss caused by seeing God's unshakable promises seemingly made null and void. Jerusalem was now just a ruined provincial town in a foreign empire, its royal family held prisoner among other exiles in a strange land. The temple, the place where God was meant to dwell among the people, was destroyed. The poems of Lamentations are trying to process this overwhelming grief and respond to God in the face of catastrophe, when all certainties about God and ourselves have been overturned. Our best suggestion is that Lamentations was written within Judah after this devastation, and may even have been used in rituals commemorating its loss. Of the 5 chapters, chapters 1, 2, and 4 are written as acrostics. Each line starts with a particular letter of the Hebrew alphabet, running in order from Aleph to Tav. You will see if you look in your Bible that these chapters have 22 verses to reflect this, although the acrostic structure doesn't carry over into English with a different alphabet. Chapter 3 turbocharges it with 3 verses per letter of the alphabet, making it 66 verses long. The final 5th chapter still has 22 verses, but it is not an acrostic. The pattern that has been established by the poet is kept and yet broken. Chapter 1 personifies Jerusalem as a widow who is now abandoned and left without hope because enemies have triumphed over her and left her bereaved. Chapter 2 depicts the actual attack on Jerusalem and God's role as judge of the people's sins, but this does not stop the poet protesting about the destruction. Chapter 3, with its 3-verse per letter acrostic, again personifies the suffering as a single man raises his lament as a representative of the whole people. Again, there is reflection on human sin and God's judgment, but this uniquely includes the prospect that God's consistency in bringing judgment offers the possibility of hope, as you can see in these verses from the middle of the chapter. Chapter 4 returns to the acrostic structure, depicting in graphic detail the horrors of the siege and contrasting Jerusalem's past with its miserable present. The final poem, 22 verses long, but no longer in alphabetical order, is a great pleading prayer for God's compassion, but is profoundly uncertain about how or even whether God will respond. So, we now turn to how Lamentations can help us as Christians, both individually and corporately, to look honestly at the state of the planet and express our collective grief. I argue that Lamentations is helpful in 3 ways, 1 broad and 2 specific. Broadly, the book helps us to learn that lament is a biblical, faithful response to suffering, that we show profound faith in God at raising sorrow and protest because of a situation. More specifically, the content of this particular book of lament can guide us by engaging with grief in a way that is both honest and empowering. And finally, the form of the poems shows us how to turn this raw emotional material into something we can use to address God and the mess we find ourselves in. To begin with lament as an acceptable Christian response to grief. Lamenting is something that occurs throughout the Bible. There is obviously the book we're looking at now. There are also different psalms of lament. Good examples, as I show there, are Psalms 44, 74, and 90. Various of the prophets are instructed to bear messages of God's lament over the people's sins, as can be found in Ezekiel or Jeremiah. And in the New Testament, we see Jesus tell women weeping at his impending crucifixion to weep instead for the fate of Jerusalem. That's Luke chapter 23, verses 27 to 31. However, Christians, and I think particularly Christians in the Western world, have tended to ignore this tradition within our scriptures. I think this is because we think it is somehow not Christian to truly feel the emotions of lament, that it undermines our claim that we believe that Jesus is Lord over all. Indeed, when I organised a sermon series on Lamentations in my church last year, one piece of feedback was that it was too depressing and didn't offer hope through Christ. Nonetheless, if we refuse to engage in lament because it is, and I quote, not hopeful, unquote, we are making a big mistake, especially regarding the climate crisis. To ignore or refuse to lament suggests it is not valid to have those feelings because God is good. But we lament because we know God is good. If you don't lament, you're somehow suggesting that there is nothing wrong and you're not being honest about the facts of your situation. As with pre-exile Judah, not lamenting means being complacent, distorting faith in God into a magic trick that means a painless outcome is always guaranteed. Biblical lament, as most clearly exemplified by the Book of Lamentations, is about being honest, honest about a situation that is not as it should be. We need to learn this discipline of lament to be realistic about our lives and therefore be honest with ourselves, with one another, and crucially, with God. Therefore, I would argue that not to lament about the havoc wrought in creation is actually a form of climate denialism, making the real promise of God's hope into an idol that reflects back vacuous platitudes about the future. Now, to those two specific lessons about Lamentations and the environment. The first is about the content of the book. It is in many places incredibly bleak. It does not flinch from depicting the horrors of war or the sense that God has turned against the author and the people. It does also contain very brief moments of hope, such as the central verses of the poems, chapter 3, verses 22 and 23. This should encourage us when it comes to our laments over the climate crises that we face, that we don't need to withhold our feelings about the situation from God. We can perfectly faithfully rail against the losses, feel the misery of knowing our part in them. This is vital, as Maria Alejandra Andrade Valenzuela says in her contribution to Words for a Dying World, edited by Hannah Malcolm. Her contribution is called When Men and Women Were Soil. To genuinely grieve, we must firstly accept our role within environmental degradation, and then feel the emotions of loss. Then follows giving space for grief, space for repentance, and then possibly the prospect of forgiveness. The Book of Lamentations has frequent first-person descriptions of emotion in response to suffering. My eyes are spent with weeping, my stomach churns, my groans are many, and my heart is faint. And this includes direct accusation towards God as a violent bully. He is a bear lying in wait for me. He shot into my vitals all the arrows of his quiver. He has made my teeth grind on gravel. The content of the poems is also immensely helpful for the way in which it is emotionally all over the place. There is bitterness, sorrow over sin, anger at God for turning on his people, trust in God as a source of hope, utter despair at the misery of Jerusalem, a desire for God to take revenge. In other words, the Book of Lamentations accurately reflects the bewilderment of a traumatized people whose certainties have been overturned by catastrophe, in the phrase of Alan Mintz. And so, our grief over the climate crisis does not need a false coherence. We need not feel bound to be ordered in our suffering when that is beyond us. I know that this is true for myself. I can feel enthused by the spread of renewable energy and the fact that even a conservative government is talking about environmentalism. But I can also despair at the fact that the Amazon rainforest has recently become a bigger emitter of carbon dioxide than a sink for it. Both those feelings can exist at the same time and be part of our lament. Lamentation shows us that we don't need to tidy up our feelings. We won't effectively act on this crisis, or indeed any other, by pretending it isn't hard, or by trying to force feelings into a mold that they don't fit into. And yet, and this is our final reflection for today, this mixed array of emotions we find in the Book of Lamentations is not just floating around, nor simply poured out on the page. It is structured, even if that structure is subverted at the end, which I'll return to. As I've mentioned, the grief in Lamentations takes the form of poetry, following the order of the Hebrew alphabet. The raw honesty and conflicted bewilderment is scaffolded by the rhythms of the poetry. So when we raise our lament, we must be prepared for the disciplined side of lament, giving proper, dedicated time and space and energy to it, not just erupting with our feelings. So, as and when you come to lament, particularly about the climate, think about how you shall lament by yourself and together, how you do it in a church worship context, as various others of our speakers have mentioned. You could incorporate it into your daily prayer or quiet time, whatever your practice is. You could write down your lament. You could even do something based explicitly on the template of Lamentations if you're feeling ambitious about acrostics. However you do it, raise your lament and raise it in a rhythm. The Book of Lamentations itself, as I say, may have been used as a liturgy for worship, a way of processing the emotions about the loss that has been experienced. But, and as I've also mentioned before, this needs to be balanced with an awareness that working out a structure for our lament will sometimes be beyond our grasp. The fifth poem in Lamentations still keeps the 22-verse pattern, but it is no longer an acrostic. It is as if the poem's structure can no longer fully contain all the feelings of grief, and it ends on an incredibly uncertain note. Restore us to yourself, O Lord, that we may be restored. Renew our days of old, unless you have utterly rejected us and are angry with us beyond measure. Our lament is not about therapy, although therapy is a good thing, nor is it a magic bullet that will automatically make us feel better about our predicament. Lament is about honesty, which can mean being honest about the fact that putting a rhythm and order to our grief is essential and also has its limits. I hope this presentation has given you something to go away and think about and do, that you will read or indeed reread the Book of Lamentations and reflect in your own ways and in your own communities on how lament, and specifically this book, can sustain us in a time of crisis. Thank you all very much for listening. I think now we have time for one or two questions.
That's wonderful, Nathan. I'm just trying to work out, do you want to put everyone on view or?
Yes, hang on, let me, oh yeah, there you go.
Isn't it? I just overridden you. I actually have a question, if, unless anybody wants to jump in there. Oh, hang on, someone has jumped in there. Okay, Simon is interested to know a bit more about disciplined lament. And actually, I think that links with my question, so I'm going to hang it on there if that's okay. Because I'm quite interested in the journey from your head to your heart with lament, and how there can be lots of things that you know, that you feel, that you know in yourself that it's something is worth lamenting, but your feelings are kind of the gap there is almost like, I don't know if it's if that makes sense, like that gap between being able to really feel that in a deep way and know it, and then I wonder if that is connected to this idea of discipline and lament. So I'm going to chuck them in there together. Thank you.
I think, and I'm going to draw on Hannah Malcolm's reflections in Words for a Dying World in this, and I highly recommend that book as a resource. It certainly has helped me. I think what we're doing with lament is not just a generalized feeling of sadness, although it starts there. Lament is actually about feeling specific loss. And I think that's where the discipline comes in. So whatever your specific loss is, whether it's a local beauty spot that you're aware has become increasingly filled with plastic, or somewhere else you love in the world, maybe you particularly love Western Germany and now are aware it's suffering under floods, maybe it's, the Sahara is spreading, or whatever it may be, that becomes the basis for your lament. So you're not just pouring forth your emotions, because that's a form of narcissism actually, and doesn't actually bring it into dialogue with God or indeed with other people. So I think what I would say is the importance and the power of a disciplined lament is that you put time and energy into it. It's not a burst of emotion in quite the same way. And I think that's one of the problems, I would say, particularly as a British person, we often think of lament as sort of a weeping Victorian widow all in black and kind of completely ridiculous, and think it's somehow ridiculous and unseemly. Whereas that's not lament in a biblical sense. Lament is disciplined. It takes time, it takes effort. I'm sure that however gifted this poet was, they had to think about their acrostic structure. And so likewise, I would say, sort of when it comes to our lament about climate crisis, it's about to be lament, it has to have some kind of coherence and thought behind it, even if it starts in that sort of eruption of emotion. I hope that's a helpful answer to the question. Yeah. Oh, I can't hear you, Katie.
I find that a really helpful answer, so thank you. And we have basically about 30 seconds if you wanted to say anything about what comes after lament and turning validated emotion into action in 30 seconds.
Okay, I think what comes after lament is the hope that God has heard us and that God responds. And I would dare to say that actually what comes after lament is not on us, it's actually on God. And that oh, I'm getting a thumbs up from someone. So that rests in God's sovereignty, as indeed the exiled Judeans found, as I'm sure we will find with the climate crisis, albeit that is not an excuse for doing nothing. There we go.
That's bravo. That's an amazing 30-second reply, and I know
I couldn't do it in acrostic. I do apologise.
We are out of time. That was huge and covered a lot, and I've given me a lot to think about, and I'm sure I'm not the only one. So thank you so much, Nathan. I'm going to stop recording now, and I'm going to say thank you all for coming and kind of send you on your happy ways to wherever you're going next. But honestly, that was really great. So thank you, and I'm sorry we didn't.
Thank you. Thanks, Katie. Thank you, everyone.
There's a link in the chat from somebody about.
Thanks, Nathan.
Yeah. Great. See you all soon.
Oh, very good. Yes.
Hello, everyone. That's an early bird. I just thought I'd say hi quickly. Hi, Simon. Nice to meet you.
Hi, nice to meet you. Can I test my microphone? Is that working all right?
It sounds great to me.
I've
Everyone
been having
else,
problems today, but it seems to be working. That's great.
That's a shame. That's a shame. How are you feeling, Simon? You ready for this?
As ready as I'm going to get.
That's a good answer.
It's hot and yes.
It really is, isn't it? I'm just trying all the things to cool down. Beth, I really like your sleeveless vicar top. Like, that's a good to know.
Very necessary.
It's very good to see a couple of dog collars because I was worried that I might be the only one. So
we had a dog collar in here just before Beth.
no, I saw Nathan's presentation. It was great.
And both him and you, I'm like, wow, there's a long sleeves for a day like this. So
Nathan's in short sleeves. I just don't think it was apparent from how he was sitting.
I'm in long sleeves but shorts and below the table that you can't see.
Okay. So
I had to have Mary Mag out today because it's her day. So.
Oh well, yeah, that works.
Can we see a bit for a second longer?
Yeah, sure.
Oh, amazing! Oh, I love it.
Sounds like it's her day. You got to get them out.
Who's on the other side?
Oh, regular Mary.
Regular Mary.
Regular Mary.
Classic Mary. Thanks so much for people who are joining us. I see the numbers are going up, so please do write where you're coming from in the chat. We'd love to know. And just as a reminder before we start, any questions in the chat as you go through, please put those in as well. And it's already 5 o'clock because time is going crazy fast today. So I'm going to introduce Simon and then I'm going to press record. So that's, again, something to be aware of if you want to switch your cameras off. And Simon is joining us from Bristol, which is where I am. So that's exciting. And you have the role, I wrote it down, Direction of Ministry Development. So maybe we'll hear a bit about that. I don't know, but that's your role within the diocese. And you're really interested in consumer culture and Christianity and in kind of, I suppose, in discipleship with that, which again, I'm looking forward to hear more about. And today we're going to look at worship. So lots of really interesting topics. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to press record and I'm going to stop talking so that Simon gets to take over for me. Okay, thank you, Simon.
Great. So thank you. It's really good to be here. And it's really good to see folk. I want to suggest 3 things in the paper that I'm about to give. First, that formation is a basic part of Christian life. All Christians are being formed. Second, that we're all formed by other things and that consumerism is a very effective tool for formation, possibly the most effective that we currently know in our world. And third, that worship is both an essential part of Christian formation and is something that has been and is shaped by consumer culture itself. And so we need to give that some critical attention. Now, this is very much a work in progress or a work in formation, if you prefer. It arises out of a professional interest in the concept of formation. For a little over a decade now, my vocation and ministry have been to support the formation of ministers in the Church of England. And I have a little note here that says that currently those beginning ordained ministry in the Church of England have got to demonstrate they meet at least 34 different formation criteria. So the curates amongst you will recognise that. But that's not what I'm talking about today particularly, however useful those tools may or may not be. Let me start with St. Paul. St. Paul, writing to the Galatians, says this: "My little children, with whom I am again in travail until Christ be formed in you." So the language of formation does have some claim to be biblically rooted, and that's more so when formative imagery is included, such as the potter and the clay, and we've just heard Lamentations being associated with Jeremiah. Within the world of the church, or at least the Church of England where I serve, the language of formation is used primarily in terms of ministerial formation. That's the way that people are supported and trained to serve as ministers in the church. And one important Church of England document speaks about it in this way: formation should be seen as the overarching concept that integrates the person, the understanding, and the competence. But I think formation is much broader than that. It's actually a way at looking at the whole of Christian discipleship. And for the record, Christian ministry that's not rooted in discipleship is not well formed in any way. Joanna Collicutt, her summary is that Christian spiritual formation can be understood as the transforming work of the Spirit in every aspect of the life of the believer. And this is a helpful summary, not least in the holistic approach it takes to formation. It's every aspect of our life that is formed and transformed by the Spirit. Jeremy Worthen has a slightly different definition. Christian formation, he writes, refers to the ways in which Christians are shaped in and for vocation, where vocation names the process of responding to God's call. This is a more active understanding. For Worthen, we're formed in order to respond to God's call. There's still a holistic approach here. The ways in which Christians are shaped constitute most of Worthen's book on the subject. But rather than attempting a comprehensive definition of formation, which is probably the task of a different paper, I want to offer 3 characteristics that might help us in seeing how we're formed and thus also how we are deformed. Formation, I suggest, is rooted, it's contextual, and it's integrating. First then, formation is rooted. Formation is the work of God in us. It's not something the church or its ministers do to anybody else. St. Paul's travail with the Galatians perhaps reflects something of the frustration that that can produce. But the roots of formation are in the work of God in us. Formation is rooted in our discipleship and in our vocation, not simply in a vocation to a particular ministry, but in our vocation to be the people who God has made us to be. Formation happens as we answer the call of Christ to follow me. Second, formation is contextual. We're formed by the people and the places that we find ourselves with and in. But there is a further context, which is what we do, the stuff, a deliberately material word rather than, say, tasks. The stuff of life is itself a context for formation. And these contexts interact. We share together in working with the stuff of life in a particular place. Our history is important, as is our relationship with the place and the people we meet. And then third, integration. Formation is about how we join all of this together in the whole of our lives. And this is really where my claim that formation as a means of speaking of discipleship gets its force. In joining the roots of formation in God, discipleship and vocation, with the context of vocation in the people and places and stuff, we see that formation is a powerful integrative force. And this is how Worthen's activism links to Collicutt's more passive account of formation. Paying attention to the integrative function of formation helps us to attend to the holistic nature of the term that both Collicutt and Worthen draw attention to. And the integrative aspect of formation issues in practices and habits, things that pull together where formation is rooted and enable that to be worked out in the context of people and places and tasks and stuff. So within these 3 characteristics, we get a sense of what is being formed, the rootedness, how that formation happens, the contextual, and the integration between the two. Formation is, of course, an open-ended process. We're never finished with it, or perhaps better, it is never finished with us. There's no point when we can stand and point and say, we are now formed. There is the potential for frustration here again, because we want to get to a place where we've arrived, where we're formed or sorted. But there is also gift to this open-endedness. When we face a future with challenges unknown and known, having Christians who are engaged in a lifelong process of formation is the only way in which new challenges can be faced. So having outlined what I hope is a fairly uncontroversial account of discipleship as formation, I want to try and persuade you now that consumer culture is itself a vehicle of formation. If Christian formation is the work of the Holy Spirit, then we do need to account for an additional means of formation. James K.A. Smith describes an incident of reading Wendell Berry in Costco, in which, and I quote, "I discovered a significant gap between my thought and my action. I was reading Wendell Berry's delightful anthology, Bringing It to the Table. As I paused to reflect on a key point, and thus briefly took my nose out of the book, I was struck suddenly by an ugly irony. Here I was, reading Wendell Berry in the food court at Costco. There are so many things wrong with that sentence that I don't even know where to begin. Indeed, the food court at Costco might be a kind of shortcut for Berry's picture of the sixth circle of hell. Smith's key insight from this incident is that thinking is not enough to get us to break out of whichever circle of hell that we're sitting in reading poetry. For now, I simply want to point to the way in which Smith has clearly identified in which intentions and education are not enough to counteract something that's deeply embedded in the way we act and behave. We have been formed by our consumer society. Jeremy Worthen has also noted this. Christian formation does not happen to people who are not being formed in any other way. Life is always forming us and shaping us. We're formed by our upbringing, by our education, by our work. We are formed by the culture in which we participate. We do not need to be able to articulate those narratives of human fulfillment which are communicated by cultural forces in order to be powerfully influenced by them. We just have to participate in the activities that communicate and affirm them. What forms us is not primarily a matter of consciously held beliefs, but of the shared practices of our day-to-day lives. So how do the three characteristics of formation work out in consumer culture? Well, I think it is rooted in our desires, contextualized in the people and places we spend time in, and integrated in our lives lived within this society. To say that consumer culture is rooted in our desires is to say that it seeks to shape and form us at the level of our desires. And there's a whole industry devoted to shaping our desires in this way. The context of people and places is likewise deeply formed by consumerism. Shopping has taken on a role in our culture that goes far beyond any utilitarian function. It's a leisure activity, a therapeutic treatment, an aspiration, and even an addiction. Zygmunt Bauman, the sociologist, speaks of the universal dependency on shopping. And roots and context come together in the integrative function that is the habits and practices that come from this. And Bauman speaks of the way that in consumer culture, we have the ability to treat any life decision as a consumer choice. Significantly, this includes many aspects of the life of faith. We've witnessed the rise of branding, of marketing approaches to evangelism, and so on. Christian faith is not immune from the formation of Christian culture. And Mark Clavier puts it this way: the church has adapted to consumerism both deliberately through policy decisions and unintentionally as the result of the transformation of Christians into conspicuous consumers. By and large, this commodification of Christianity can be seen in everything from the increasingly profitable contemporary Christian music industry to the many forms of devotional practice that are directed towards niche markets and the branding of church initiatives. Christian formation may be happening, but there's a very powerful alternative formation going on at the same time, the formation that comes from a consumerist culture. What then are we to do? Well, if we're to be reformed to deal with the deforming formation of consumerism, then we need to engage with something that will attend to the rootedness, the context, and the integrative functions of formation. And we need something that can help with a critical account of formation that will engage with the Spirit of God and shape our lives in a way that enables Christ to be formed in us. Such an approach needs to be more than theory or education, as Jamie Smith's story of reading Wendell Berry in Costco demonstrates. Nor should we try to tackle consumer formation head on. Consumer culture is very plastic and resilient, brought home to me deeply when I came across a book all about Amazon's deleterious contributions to the economic and social life of our world, for sale on Amazon. Catherine Tanner speaks of a new world to which Christianity points, an imaginative counter to the whole world of capitalism as it presently exists, and which operates not at a remove from finance-dominated capitalism, but by cutting across it, traversing it to disruptive effect. And how do we access this? Well, Jamie Smith prescribes worship. Christian worship, he says, is essentially a counter formation to those rival liturgies we are often immersed in, cultural practices that covertly capture our loves and our longings. And yet the tragedy is that we've already seen is that consumerism can and does impact on all aspects of Christian life, including worship. Mark Clavier is pessimistic about this. Consumerism is the lens through which Christian sacraments are understood. which means that those sacraments are now at least one step removed from actual human life. It will not surprise you, perhaps, to know that I'm a little more optimistic, but I do not have a simple solution. There's no easy formula, no set of prescriptions for worship that will guarantee to reform us as Christian disciples. But all worship can contribute to this task. To return to my threefold approach to formation, the root of worship is the living God. It is the living God who will reform us, not any liturgy or act of worship. There are dangers in the consumerization of worship, but there are equal dangers in the attempt to counter consumerism in worship. Rather, worship must attend primarily to God and not to ourselves, even if that's based in our formation. The encounter with the living and holy God, which is the heart and root of worship, will reform us. And it does so as we worship God, not as we try to be reformed. Worship is what transverses our deformation to disruptive effect, as Catherine Tanner would have it. The context of worship, the people, the places, and the stuff of worship must speak of God. We gather with God's people, not on our own for worship. Even solitary worship is an encounter with God in the presence of the saints and the angels. Prayer and worship is always a corporate action. And the place of our worship is the creation that God brought into being and in which God will come to dwell at the end of everything. And we who worship are creatures. I remind you of Lynn White's charge against Christianity back in 1967, that Christians, especially in the West, have forgotten that they are creatures and instead see that nature has no reason for existence save to serve man. In worship, we come as creatures before our creation. We bring the gifts of creation and offer them and ourselves to our Creator. And what integrates the roots of formation and the context is the practices that sustain this, the habits and practices of worship that keep us true to the roots, to the living God, and keep us attentive to the context in which we are formed and reformed, that is, of being creatures. Liturgy alone will not do this, but without liturgies that are rooted in God and which celebrate our creatureliness, we will not experience the integrative power of formation. Now, I've said that I don't have an answer, so instead let me end with three questions. Firstly, how do we keep God at the centre of our worship and not ourselves or even our laudable causes? Secondly, where in worship are we most conscious of being creatures made by the Creator? And third, what are the habits that keep us rooted in the God that we worship, conscious of our context as creatures, and that therefore allow the integrative power of formation to reform us? Thank you.
Simon, that was great. Thank you so much. Would it be possible to write those three questions in the chat, just so
I will do that now.
we can keep them in our heads? That would be brilliant. I'm waiting for any questions from the participants to come through, but I have one to get started with, if that's okay. Which is, I'm just interested in. It's a really obvious question, really, but it's what are you, when you talk about worship, what do you mean? I mean, it's an obvious question because it makes me look obvious, not like it's obvious that you should have answered it.
It's a brilliant question, because there is a sense in which all of life is worship. So I think I mean the moments when consciously we try to be attentive to ourselves in the presence of God. Whether that be with words or without words, singing when we're allowed to do it, or silence. It's the consciously bringing ourselves into the presence of God that I think I have in mind here. But thank you, that's a really helpful question.
That's a great answer. Thank you so much. Lovely. And we have a question from Samantha, but I know that you're typing right now, so I don't mean to disrupt, so I'll just give you a second. And Samantha is a new curate, so that's exciting. And Sorry, I'm they're lovely. There we go. Brilliant. Thank you. The question is how to apply this when planning a service. So she's a new curate, process of learning.
I think two really simple things. One, make sure it's about God. I've been to services which end up being about human beings one way or another. And I think the other would be, and this is the hard one because I think we're not so good at this, but how do we come as creatures? There's a humility there, and we're not very good at being creatures. That, I think, that's why I quoted the Lynn White article, which is one of the first kind of engagements between ecology and Christianity way back in the 60s, and pointing to the Western tradition of dominance over creation as being problematic. But where are we being creatures? I think the best I can come up with is on Ash Wednesday, when we have ash put on ourselves in liturgical churches, and the words are, remember you are dust and to dust you will return. And that's a reminder not of sinfulness but of creatureliness. How do we do creatureliness in the rest of worship? I think Hazelnut Farm are an incredible community because one of the ways they do creatureliness is that they worship with the context of soil and plants. St. Francis did creatureliness by invoking the praise of all creation as brothers and sisters and members of the same created family. So you have, brother sun and sister moon, if I got that the wrong way around. So yeah, that's a short one, I think.
No, thank you. And I really like how that links to Rose's question, which is about, you said that worship must be in community, or that she thinks she heard you say that worship must be in community, and living on our own a long way from any church that she can get involved with. What does worship on her own mean, and with other creatures around, not human? Oh, and then, yeah.
Can I join that with the online one, which is afterwards, from Susan about, so I think I've
just lost you, but
sorry, are you hearing me now?
There we go. Feel free to join the questions together. Yeah.
So we never worship on our own. We always worship with the communion of saints and with the angels. That's good Christian teaching. It's a shame that Beth put a video off because she's displaying tattoos which are marvelous for this purpose. There we go. That doesn't always feel like we're worshipping with other creatures. There's absolutely no reason why we can't see the birds and the wind in the trees and other things as part of the voice of creation worshipping God. I think St. Francis certainly did that. I think I also want to this is where I want to join it with the online church stuff, that one of the things that has come across really powerfully during the pandemic, and it's a bit of a mea culpa really, is just how much some people depend on technology for human interaction, and that as we now possibly briefly move into a season of coming back to be with other people for worship and for other things, I really am hoping and trying to work with my colleagues in this diocese to ensure that we don't forget those for whom actually the rush of online worship was a real gift, because it enabled them to connect with church. So I don't think online church is necessarily consumerist. I don't think any kind of church is necessarily consumerist. Alpha courses and Messy Church, which have all of the branding and trappings of a certain form of consumerism, can be places where we encounter the living God, can be places where we encounter our own creatureliness, And that's why I talk about not trying to hit consumerism head on, but traversing it, cutting across it, because I think that's how God is at work here. And God can even work in consumerism, bizarrely. So I want to affirm people trying to worship on their own. If technology is helpful, then by all means do it. And those who are leading worship online, I think, have a harder task in being creaturely and share in the hard task of this being an opportunity to encounter the living God.
That's great. Thank you. I think that I like the idea of cutting across consumer, traversing. That was the word you used, wasn't it? I think that's a lovely word. We have about 30 seconds left. You wanted to speak to something around what more could be done to broaden a contemporary table worship around communion. Then feel free. But if that's too big an ask, I hold my hands up.
There's a whole piece of work to do on how all of this relates to the Eucharist, and to a certain extent William Kavanagh's book on consuming faith might be helpful to Rod. Kavanagh talks that we are consumed by God in the Eucharist rather than simply consuming the Eucharist, which is a lovely play on words. But I'd love to, but I don't think we've got time in 30 seconds to unpack that.
Thank you for pointing towards that, and could you pop that name in the chat if that's okay? Just I'm sure there's people.
I will do that.
Up on that. That's been brilliant. Thank you so much, Simon. Really appreciate everything you brought today, and I hope that you get, if people want to connect with you, I'm sure there'll be ways through to through the hazelnut literature. So yeah, thank you so much, and thank you everyone for coming, and enjoy your final seminar as it approaches.
Thank you for your questions. They were really, really helpful.